right, ladies and gentlemen, once again, welcome and thank you for joining us today. We got a very, very special, in my judgment, operation for you today because Ambassador Paul Brenner, who has really served our nation for over 40 years in many, many crucial diplomatic and other assignments and the like, and has a wealth of really a treasure trove of knowledge, some of which I think he'll share with us today because he has, as usual, a great group of commitments and the like. We're just reminiscing a little bit together, and just to tell you how old I am, I first met the ambassador in 1976 when he was a boy State Department gentleman with in the embassy at Norway, and I was, of course, the commander of the Marine forces that were involved in reinforcing North Norway and the like. And we had, and we've our paths have crossed many, many times since then. When he was ambassador in the Netherlands and the like, and then of course later on. We crossed trails again in 1979 when the Federal Bureau of Investigation held their first real big meeting, if you will, on global terrorism. And, of course, Ambassador Bremer was there, and as were many others. And so the point I want to make here is that all through the years, he was one person that we as a nation or that we as a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, whatever the particular assignments that we had through the years, we could go to for good, sound advice and thought process on terrorism and on a whole group of other subjects as well. So he's well educated, as we all know, went to Yale. I won't hold that against him, but then later advanced education in Paris, and then, of course, like all people who try to be more important than they really are, he went to Harvard and got a little business training and the like. But at any rate, we're delighted that you could find the time to join us, Ambassador Brenner, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Al. I'm reminded, I usually paraphrase President Kennedy when it comes to that and say, you know, because I didn't study at all in New Haven, I say I had the advantage of a Harvard education and a Yale degree.
That's trouble.
I'm going to talk about that in a minute, actually. Well, I had originally, when I agreed to do this event with Yona, had been thinking I was going to talk about the broad geopolitical problems, in particular the problems that we face in the United States in the challenge of continuing our leadership. I will get to that, but in light of this audience and my own experience now of almost 40 years of fighting terrorism and the events in Paris, I thought I'd better start by talking about the events in Paris and try to relate that to the broader situation. Now, I have sort of 3 points. Contrary to what all the pundits and so-called experts and the journalists have said, the events, the attacks on Charlie Hebdo do not represent a new form of terrorism. They are a tactical adaptation as part of a broad, long-standing terrorist strategy. That's the first point, and I'll talk a little more about that. Secondly, this jihadist strategy is a danger to the United States. It poses a significant danger to the United States, as it did after 9/11. And how we respond is going to be very important. That's the third point. The way in which we respond, we in the West respond, will have a lot to say about what kind of a century the 21st century is going to be. Now, let me take first the point that it's not new. I have a vivid memory of a Wednesday morning in Paris at the Ministry of Interior in Place Beauvau. At the time, the Minister of Interior was a very rough Corsican named Charles Pasqua. And if any of you have ever met Corsicans, you know when a Corsican is rough, he's really rough. He was a terrific Minister of Interior. We had very close relations. I was at that time Ambassador at Large for Counterterrorism. He had called me Tuesday afternoon, Washington time, to say, I need you to come over, Ambassador, tomorrow. I've got some news for you. So I flew over that night. And in his ornate elaborate Louis XVI office at Place Beauvau, he told me that they had discovered a cache of explosives and weapons in Bois de Boulogne about 3 or 4 weeks earlier. So being good policemen, they basically staked it out to see who came for the stuff. And that day, Tuesday, a group of Hezbollah terrorists had come and started digging up the stuff. And what he told me that was interesting, he said that their objective, their stated objective when they were captured, was to establish the Islamic Republic of France. Now, in 1987, that was pretty shocking news. I can tell you, I've been fighting a lot of terrorists, but I'd never heard anybody talking about the Islamic Republic of France. Spin the clock forward 10 years, and I was appointed chairman of the Bipartisan National Commission on Terrorism. 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, appointed by the House, by the Speaker of the House. We studied the question of terrorism and reported to President Clinton, the American people, and Congress 15 years ago now, 15 years ago this June, that the United States faced a new form of terrorism, an extremist, Islamic, jihadist-oriented terrorism. And we predicted, as it turned out unfortunately correctly, that these terrorists would conduct mass casualty attacks on the American homeland. This was 15 months before 9/11. Why did we say that? We studied the record. And let me just read you a few of the comments that came to our attention. Ayatollah Khomeini said, "Those who study jihad will understand why Islam wants to conquer the whole world. Islam says, kill all the unbelievers just as they would kill you." He said that, by the way, in 1942. The founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Sayyid Qutb, quote, "The ultimate objective of the Islamic movement of jihad is to be carried throughout the earth to the whole of mankind." 1955. Nothing new about this. Abu Bakr Bashir, who is an Indonesian terrorist, so just to say it's not just in the Middle East, said in 2005, "Islam and the West are at war, and Islam must win, and the Westerners will be destroyed." The head of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Abu Musab Zarqawi, while I was actually in Iraq, said, "Now you see before you people who love death just as you love life. Killing for the sake of God is their highest wish." Now, let me just say, these do not represent the views of the majority of Muslims. I'm simply quoting Muslim extremists. I'm not saying that that's the way all Muslims are. I'm not even taking a position on whether or not that represents a valid interpretation of Islam. I'm not a Muslim, so I'm not qualified to make it. I'm just telling you that's what they said, and those are the precepts on which they have since then acted. Now, people sometimes say, well, what is the root cause of this hatred of the West? How can we deal with it? Well, it's really quite simple. In their speeches, in their press conferences, in their fatwas, and more recently on their websites, in their blogs, these extremists, starting with Osama bin Laden and all the others, have made it clear that the thing they hate most of all about the West is the West. They hate us for who we are, not for what we do. They hate us for who we are. How do I know that? Because they say, we are against freedom of the press. We are against free trade unions. We are against women's education. We are against elections. We hate most of all democracy. Ayman Zawahiri, the current head of Al-Qaeda, still alive and well somewhere, has said, democracy is a new religion that must be destroyed by war. There is no question about what they think. Now, with people like this, with extremists like this, there's no compromise. There's nothing that they're asking for that we can give them, because they want us, the Western civilization, effectively to go away, to be conquered, to be killed. That's their agenda. They've said it over and over now for a period going back as long as 70 years. That is the view of Islamic extremists that we are up against. This is a global war. These extremists, the warriors, are sprinkled everywhere, from the eastern shore of the Mediterranean to the Indus River, from the deserts of North Africa all the way across to the Red Sea, down to the Arabian Peninsula, across the waters to Somalia, and they are rampaging at large, apparently at will, in Africa's largest country today, where Boko Haram has also declared itself a new caliphate. Now, the relationship of this to us with the attack last week on Charlie Hebdo. Freedom of the speech is a core value of Western civilization. It's not a coincidence that it's the First Amendment to our Constitution. And it's not a coincidence that the terrorists chose an element of the press in France, the free press, as their target. Yet here in the United States and in Europe, there are signs, have been signs of a sort of unilateral intellectual disarmament in the face of these kinds of threats. We all saw the pusillanimous initial reaction of Sony to the threats by the North Koreans. We saw that the Associated Press pulled Charlie Hebdo cartoons from its gallery because they were afraid some of them might be, quote, hurtful to people. For a week, the Washington Post here refused to publish the cartoons. Thanks to the brave men who run the editorial page, they did publish the cartoon on the editorial page last week. But the paper itself refused to publish it. They did in the end, finally. And the American government took quite a while to figure out what to call these events. First, they didn't call them a terrorist event. Then they just called it a terrorist event, and they still won't call it what it really is, which is Islamic terrorism, jihadist extremism. They still won't say that. Why is there this reluctance to call things as they are? My own view is a lot of it has to do with the atmosphere of political correctness that has overtaken a lot of America and a lot of Europe, I must say. If you look at colleges and universities, there are these codes of conduct, codes of verbal conduct, things which are allowed and not allowed to be said, which have had the effect of tamping down freedoms in those. Let me tell you the two places that the general mentioned. At Yale, where I went, Yale published several years ago an academic book about the Danish cartoons. You remember the Danish cartoons by the Jylland Post? They published a full academic study and decided not to put the cartoons in the book. An act of exemplary cowardice by Yale. At Harvard, not to be outdone, the president of Harvard had the timidity of suggesting that a useful form of research would look into the question, undeniable fact, that women are not as well represented in the hard sciences as men. And he thought that would be something that an academic would be worth studying. Why is that? He got fired. He's no longer president of Harvard. So this unilateral intellectual disarmament is a serious problem. Now, what are the implications of all this for American foreign policy? Just to move to a broader point. First of all, 3/4 of all Americans alive today were born after World War II. They have grown up in a world of expanding freedom, freer trade, freedom of expression, freedom of the high seas. They take for granted the liberal political atmosphere we live in. I use the word liberal just so I don't confuse people in the classic European sense of liberal, open and free. Progress towards a more liberal world was not inevitable. As a scholar known to many of you here, Robert Kagan, has reported, the values of the world's hegemon at any given time, the values of the world's hegemon determine the values that are adopted by the international community. And the internationally liberal order in which we live today, that we've grown accustomed to, is actually quite young. It dates only to the 1830s, which is when Britain abolished their corn laws to open their borders to trade, outlawed slavery, and reformed the rotten borough political system. And for the next century, it was the Royal Navy that policed the seas to have freedom of the seas. This was not inevitable. As Kagan points out, if you go back to Spain under Philip II, or France under the Louis, or the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, none of those countries would have imposed a liberal economic and political value system. Now, the United States, at the end of the Second World War, the United States inherited the role that Britain was exhausted, and we got the job of being the hegemon and of policing the freedom, promoting the freedom of the seas, policing the freedom of the seas, promoting free trade, and defending the freedoms that are listed in our very Constitution. All of this order, it seems to me, is potentially at risk, which is why it's so important that we react vigorously just to these acts that happened last week, but more broadly to this overall geopolitical problem. Now, I know from reading the polls and listening to all the pundits that Americans are, quote, tired of war. For the first time in 70 years, Pew polls are showing that both political parties are calling for America to pay more attention at home. We hear from politicians, not only are they tired of war, but it's time to mind our own business. Or polls show the Americans no longer want to be the world's policemen. Of course, these comments raise two questions. What is America's business? And what kind of a world would it be if we're not the policemen? You know, in my speaking around the country, been to a lot of cities, I often ask when this question comes up about not being the world's policeman, if I'm talking in Chicago, do you have policemen in Chicago? Do you have policemen in Des Moines? Do you have policemen in Eugene, Oregon? Of course you do. What kind of a city would it be if there were no policemen? What kind of a world is it going to be if there are no American policemen? Now, American defense spending is at an all-time low as a percent of the federal budget. I won't go through all the details, but if the budget and the sequestration stay in place, we are on track to have the smallest army we've had since 1939, the smallest Navy since 1917, and the smallest Air Force in our history. That does not suggest a country which is prepared to continue to be the leader in defending liberal world order. Now, of course, military power isn't the only way to defend and advance American interests. But as Frederick the Great said, who knew a thing or two about both diplomacy and war, diplomacy without arms is like music without notes. It isn't going to work. Now, some people argue, and I've heard it said over, and we've heard it really almost for 20 years, that the era of great power conflict is over. But this is exactly what the pundits and cognoscenti said exactly 101 years ago in 1914. In the early 20th century, the conventional wisdom was that the nation state itself was becoming irrelevant. Don't forget that in the 1890s and right through the first 15 years of the 20th century, travel was freer in Europe than it is today. There was no need for a Schengen group. There was no need for all that. There were no visas. There were no passports. Don't forget that Britain and Germany were each other's largest trade partners. Their royal families were intermarried. Wilhelm was, after all, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria. They regularly visited each other. I sometimes point out that sometimes Willem's visits to the annual regatta in the Isle of Wight they weren't always conducive to better relations between Germany and Britain. But the fact of the matter is, absolutely nobody thought there would be a reason for great power war, or particularly between Britain and Germany. And yet Europe, 101 years ago, staggered into the biggest political catastrophe of modern European history, because I include one of its results was World War II. It was an absolute catastrophe. So it is not enough to say that just because everybody gets along, there isn't going to be a war. Now, I know history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but as the great American philosopher Mark Twain said, sometimes it rhymes. And it's worth paying attention to where we are today, because we've all heard the same arguments. Modern communication, ease of travel, the internet, dependence on each other for trade. Those are all the things that were said all throughout the 1890s for the first 15 years of the previous century, and yet the war came. So here's the question for us. If America is not prepared to continue to be the global hegemon, what are the alternatives? I see that there are three in theory, none of them very tasteful. The first is that we get replaced as the world's hegemon. Okay, there are three possible replacements: Russia, China, and Europe. One can dismiss Russia and China rather quickly if you want to have a liberal world order. No need to argue about that. Neither of them are politically or economically liberal. Europe certainly shares our values and has significant soft power. But the Europeans are completely transfixed by their own political and now economic problems, and have so cut their defense budgets that they cannot even, as we saw in Libya and Mali, they can't even project power across the Mediterranean without American help. So there isn't going to be a single hegemon to replace us. Second alternative is you have a multipolar world. We say, well, you don't really need a hegemon. We can just have everybody get along, you know. Since one of my professional deformations is as a historian, I would just point out that the multipolar worlds of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries led to essentially perpetual war. And today, with many states, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Libya, Mali, maybe others, potentially falling apart on sectarian basis, then I would refer you to the pre-Westphalian Europe. If you liked pre-Westphalian Europe, you're going to love a multipolar 20th century. So that option doesn't look very appealing. Well, the third option, not going to have a replacement hegemon, not going to have a multipolar world, is, well, we can maybe hand off all of our responsibilities to the UN or some international organization. I won't spend a lot of time on this because the failures of the League of Nations, the UN, and I would argue even the difficulties that the Europeans find trying to run a multinational organization or structure, political structure, suggest that option isn't going to work. So there actually is no alternative to continued American leadership if we want to have a reasonably peaceful 21st century. If we want to enjoy the kinds of freedoms that were trampled on last week in Paris and are challenged around the world, not just by Muslim extremists, but by other autocratic regimes, Americans are going to have to advocate for, and yes, where necessary, fight for those freedoms. June 15th this year, we will celebrate the 800th anniversary of the signing of Magna Carta by King John. Those events at Runnymede 800 years ago this summer really set in motion the entire difficult, long struggle to reach where we have reached in terms of individual freedoms, because Magna Carta established that there was no single political power In that case, the king had to share power with the barons. It was an important signal first event towards the freedoms we enjoy. I hope this June 15th that we'll be able to celebrate again that we've got a government here and in Europe, governments that are prepared to stand up for those same freedoms. Thank you.
Super. No, go ahead, sit down. Very good. You want to moderate? No, go make a speech.
No speeches. Well, I don't just stand up here.
Okay.
You
Oh, you want to answer?
Yeah, I'll just
Okay,
stand up here.
all right.
Okay, I guess we're doing questions.
Right, as moderator, I would like to open the discussion with you, and if I may, I would have that privilege to ask you one or two questions. You obviously tried to provide a historical context, which is so critical, and we know from history that unfortunately we don't learn from history, but at any rate,
We learn from history, we don't learn from history.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, there are different views, but 33 years ago, and by the way, as academics, obviously we look at the calendar every single day, and the month of January, I recall 33 years ago, Malcolm Kerr, who was the president of the American University in Beirut, was assassinated. I knew him because he was at UCLA and all that, by the jihadist group there, and the Hezbollah involvement in Iran and all that. So my question to you again, since you began with the lessons of history, what, in your view, are the most critical challenges on the terrorism level that we have to be concerned about, those policymakers that wakes them up at night? Is it homegrown terrorism in terms of the perpetrators? Is it the cyber terrorism or weapons of mass destruction in terms of the intensity of the nature of the threat in the United States and, of course, globally?
Well, I think that the homegrown terrorists, which is sort of the fashion of the day because of a lot of things that have recently happened, at least for the time being, it certainly is a danger. It's a very hard one to deal with because these people travel, can travel and get training, as we saw in the case of the Charlie Hebdo, and come back using, in that case, French passports. They were French citizens. From a practical point of view, it's very difficult to stop that. And the only good news is, at least for the time being, they are relatively restrained in terms of the damage they can do. Not to suggest any lack of sympathy for the people who died in Paris, but there's a big difference between 15 people dying and 3,000 people dying. However, we can't rest. We must assume, because they have said so, I read some statements, I could read more, that the terrorists particularly would like to have an ability for mass casualty terrorism, as we predicted in the National Commission on Terrorism, as we predicted they would. The most significant way for them to do that would be to get weapons of mass destruction, where I think actually the biggest danger is biological, for a lot of reasons. All of which means, what do we do about it? All of which means intelligence. Now, I've been at this game for foreign policy for more than 50 years. Twice before, I saw what happens when we start to dismantle our intelligence capabilities. We did it in 1975, 76 to 79, and we paid a very heavy price in not being able to understand what was happening in Iran, in Nicaragua, and particularly in Russia when they went into Afghanistan. In the 1990s, we did it again when the then director of CIA put very restrictive guidelines on how to go about recruiting terrorist agents. And we paid a price. I don't say that 9/11 would have been caught if we hadn't had those in place, but it's absolutely clear we paid a big price. We're in the next cycle now. We have discounted the terrible effect of what Snowden has done, whom our president called a hacker. He's not a hacker, he's a traitor. And what he did was substantially hurt our capabilities to get good intelligence about terrorists. We now have the fight going on between the parties, and I'm not going to get into it, about the enhanced interrogation techniques. But the effect of that, I know from talking to friends still in the intelligence community, is to put a damper on their enthusiasm to take risks. And I'm telling you, there's no point in having a covert intelligence service unless it takes risks. If you're not going to take risks, then you just have, that's what you got the State Department for. You have to have a risk-taking culture. Intelligence about terrorism is the most difficult target there is in the world. It's much more difficult to understand that than to understand the Chinese order of battle, because we have ways of knowing about the Chinese order of battle. But terrorists are organized on a cellular basis so that everybody is kept in the dark except the top guys. So you have to have somebody inside the terrorist group, inside the cell, at a reasonable high level to figure out what's actually going on. And so if you say to me, against these dangers, what do we do? The very first thing we've got to do is we've got to pay attention to our intelligence capabilities, both our electronic and our human intelligence. That's what we got to do. And we need to be very concerned about the potential of terrorist groups getting weapons of mass destruction. And I would, of course, nuclear would also be a big, but that's a much more complicated problem for the terrorists, thank God.
One more question, if I may, on the response. How do you see the role of the civic society to combat terrorism? Because according to our studies, we do know that the governments cannot do it alone without the support of the public. And my question is, for example, if we take different segments of the society, the role of religion, for example, the religious community, because of the propaganda elements and the exploitation of religious ideas, terms, and concepts, and all that, or the role of education, dealing with that. You spoke about the intellectual, maybe bankruptcy, and the role of the media that covers terrorism and so on. So in other words, can we somehow focus on the role of the civic society in the United States and around the world?
Well, there are a number of answers, Yona. Let me, of course, in the end, you have to mobilize the population. No question about that. On the question of religious communities, it's not for us to define the bounds of acceptable, wrong word. It's not for us to define the bounds of what is permitted or not permitted in Islam. That's for Muslims to do, and it basically, I've said now for 40 years, it is moderate Muslims who are going to have to stand up and do the fight. And I must say, to my surprise, President Sisi gave an extraordinary speech in Al-Azhar University, I think January 1st, which he basically said to this is you all know, it's the intellectual center of the Arab world for 1,000 years. And he said, we have got to come up with a reformation of Islam to deal with these extremists. And he is, after all, somebody who knows something about the Muslim Brotherhood, which Sayyid Qutb founded, who I quoted earlier. That's the kind of thing we have to see, not what we heard out of the Turkish President Erdogan the day before yesterday, where he's condemning us. It's our fault that we were attacked. That's not responsible Muslim leadership. In the end, this problem is going to have to be solved by Muslims. We should support the moderates wherever we can, through whatever means, through the media, through social media, all that good stuff. And speaking of the media, I will know that we're on the track of beginning to get rid of this political correctness when our media starts attacking these speech codes that are at every single American university. How can that possibly be in the interest of the journalists to allow these speech codes? It's not allowed. You can't say this, you can't say that, because it's, quote, considered hurtful to someone. Well, a lot of things are considered hurtful to people, but that's not a reason to suppress freedom of speech. So I'll be very happy when the American media starts paying attention to that. But in the end, the Muslim world is going to have to solve this problem. With our help, sure. Where necessary, even military help. But it's going to have to be moderate Muslims who speak up, what we used to call the silent majority, because I'm sure that's what it is, a majority. Ambassador Luqman, I know he has to, Ambassador Faili, he has to leave. He's he's not an old friend. He's not even old.
I hope I'm a good friend.
A good friend.
First of all, Happy New Year. And let me thank you, Ambassador, for your hard work and support to Iraq, and we will always seek that. And we will always look forward to your input into how we can improve and strengthen the American-Iraqi relationship. I have two simple questions. One, in relation to the indispensability of United States. Do you see the current structure and culture in D.C. and others will help, or do you think that there is a key question in relation to cooperation between White House, Congress, and others to strengthen that or not? And the other question is, do you see the current situation in relation to ISIS, and more so in relation to Iraq, as a good example in which this indispensability can be articulated better? Thank you.
Those are good questions, Ambassador Faili. First, on the situation in Washington, it's no surprise we have a two-party system here. And that's good. I'm very much in favor of it. I'm always very critical of this idea that partisanship should not be part of our politics. Of course it should be part of our politics. It's essential to our politics. That's why we have political parties. They should be disagreeing. Now, the outlook for the next couple of years, I think, is it's going to be pretty hard to get to a consensus. And so we probably have to wait and see what happens with. I mean, there are isolationist voices in both political parties. In fact, when you listen to some of them talk, you are reminded of the French expression, les extrêmes se touchent. You know, you get far enough left and far enough right, and you wound up talking to each other. And there's good examples of this right now in Washington. On the question of ISIS, let me say this. I thought it was a serious mistake to pull all of our troops out at the end of 2011. And people should remember that the Iraqi army that people are now so disdainful of, the Iraqi army, with American help during the surge, defeated al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was defeated. There's no reason to believe the Iraqi army can't defeat ISIS, which is just the son of al-Qaeda in Iraq. Baghdadi was a member of the al-Qaeda in Iraq. It's the same organization with a different name. So I have absolute confidence that the Iraqi army, once reconstituted and once the officer corps that had become highly partisan under the previous Iraqi government, I have confidence they can succeed. So I give, excuse me, though I think the president made a serious mistake in 2011, pulling the troops out. I give him credit for making what was a very tough decision to go back in, to put boots on the ground again. That's what they are. And they're, by the way, also combat boots, but let's not argue about the definition. I think it has still been, and I think to his credit, because of the air campaign, we have at least stopped the forward motion of ISIS. They're not coming further in Anbar. Trouble is, the Iraqi government still faces the much more difficult task of retaking the urban centers, Tikrit, Mosul, Fallujah, Samarra. That will be much more difficult. It, in my view, will necessarily involve a more robust American assistance, probably more forward placed, so that there will be forward observers doing some targeting, because you can't just bomb your way to success in Mosul. So I give the president credit for making a very difficult decision that was against his previous record, against his base, and he has carried it out. I would like to see it more robustly carried out. I believe it will succeed in time in Iraq. I'm less certain about the outcome in Syria, where, as the Wall Street Journal pointed out today, in fact, while ISIS is being pushed back in Iraq, it has gone forward in Syria, taking over parts that were formerly controlled by the so-called moderate rebels. So it's a mixed picture.
What is your opinion?
One second.
Pardon me? Oh, Wayne Zaidman. In the news today, they mentioned that 5 Gitmo detainees were released with the Yemeni backgrounds from Al-Qaeda in Yemen. And in light of what happened in France with the connection with Yemen, I'm just wondering what your opinion is on the timing of releasing these 5 terrorists, and if you think the president's intent on shutting down Gitmo entirely before he leaves office.
Well, I don't, excuse me. Let me just make a practical point and then a philosophical point. Practically, I don't think he's going to be able to close it down in the next 2 years, even though he is still able to send batches of these guys back, and at least according to the press, and that's all I know, these 5 were picked up back in 2001, 2003 on suspicions of connections with Al-Qaeda that turned out to be wrong. So who knows? They're not going back to the Yemen. I think the administration's made clear it's not going to send any of the Yemenis back to Yemen. Whether you will have recidivism, which has been the case, we've had about a 30% rate of recidivism of these guys going back into terrorism again. Although the administration says its recidivism rate is lower. So I don't know. But there's a hard core of something like 61 or 62 of these guys who he's not going to be able to place out. I don't think Congress will let him bring them to the United States for trial. So I don't see how he's going to be able to close it. But let me make a more general point. I want to go back to the point about intelligence. Because while I'm a supporter of the drone attacks, we have to remember that 2 things happen. We kill the person who might have been able to give us good intelligence, if we do it right. And secondly, we largely kill some of his friends and maybe family. So I would much prefer, just like the case of that I mentioned of Interior Minister Pasqua in 1987, it's better to capture those Hezbollah guys and find out what they're up to. Where did they get their weapons? Where did they go? As the French police are doing today. They found the guy in Belgium who sold the weapons. This is called good police work. And you do that by having live people talk to you about what they know, not by killing them. Again, I'm in favor of drone strikes when it's the only way to do it. But we do lose the capacity for important intelligence if that's the only way we respond. And if we treat terrorists as if they were just criminals and therefore have a right to legal representation the moment we take them into custody, which is the problem we fell into also in the 90s. Big mistake. Please.
Sir, hi. George Nicholson, a policy consultant for the U.S. Special Operations Command. One of the things the previous commander, Admiral Bill McRaven, now the Chancellor of the University of Texas, talked about is we can surge forces, but we can't surge trust. And the problems we're having. I was at a session with Ambassador Crocker 2 weeks ago. And he was talking about the problems, for instance, in Pakistan, and going back to the Pressler Amendment and the damage that that did with us. My friend, former Ambassador White Fowler to Saudi Arabia, very close to the Saudi royal family, talks about their concerns about the way we treated the Shah of Iran after he left, the way we treated Mubarak, even though he had problems. And again, we find, for instance, in SOCOM, the issue of the Leahy Amendment, the political correctness of trying to
Right.
vet people. Your comments on those kinds of problems.
Well, trust really comes down to credibility. And one of the criticisms I have of this administration is that I don't think when they came into office they understood that credibility is the currency of national security policy. It's not the aircraft carriers, the F-22s, the Marines. They're all an important part. But at the heart of it all, the other countries have to believe you mean what you say. Especially, this is true, if you are the world's hegemon. If you're Guatemala, you can fudge around a little at the margins. If you're the United States and you say Assad must go, you have to mean it. If you say Assad can't use chemical weapons, you have to mean it. And so one of the concerns I have, particularly in the area of the Middle East, is that we have given the impression, I don't think it was intended, but that was the impression that we're sort of withdrawing from the region, leading from behind in Syria. And of course that then, you use the word trust, I use credibility. They're closely related. Friends of ours in the region, the Saudis would be a good example, have to be concerned. And they're, of course, mostly concerned about what we're going to do with Iran, because that's the geopolitical competition that interests them. The problem with losing credibility is it's much harder to get it back than it is to lose it. I mean, it's an interesting sort of academic question. You can lose credibility by going this far back, but to get back to here, you got to go here. In fact, in some ways, you almost have to react even more strongly to reestablish your credibility. And that's going to be a problem for the next administration. Whatever administration it is going to be to try to recoup the trust, the credibility that has been lost somewhat. Iman.
We all know
You have to identify yourself, I think, according to the rules.
Okay, my name is Imad Dia. I worked with Ambassador Bremer in Iraq during the CPA, and I worked for the Iraqi government as Secretary General of the Council of Ministers, and now I'm just helping the Iraqi government in some advice I give to them. All right. The point I'm trying to make, we really need also to address the roots of terrorism. Where are the roots of terrorism? Where they draw their elements of support, where they draw their finance, and even in intelligence. And also we know Islam has many sects, or several sects. And we've seen some sects made fatwa for their people to join ISIS and fight with them. Other sects made fatwa to fight ISIS. And I also like what I heard from President Sisi last week, or last 10 days. And we need to support that. There are some of our allies. They are teaching in school these thoughts that feed ISIS power.
Right.
So we really need to address that as well. Thank you.
Well, I agree, Imad, with all of those observations. we were talking about the Saudis. I mean, the Saudis played a very important role in establishing madrasas in Pakistan, which, to put it nicely, teach a rather radical form of Islam to some students. They've also funded quite a number of madrasas in the United States. So, and we need to be able to talk frankly in private with people like that, with our friends in Saudi Arabia, to say, this is not consistent with the kind of world we want to see. So I agree with all of the points you make that we have to do all of those things. Yes, sir.
Kyle Olson with the Olson Group. Mr. Ambassador, you outed yourself already as a historian, and so I wanted to ask you a question from a historic context. When we look at the radical Islamic movement today, and it's a collection of movements, and it's worldwide and global, there's obviously a romance there to their ideology. There's a narrative there that has obviously captured the imagination of people in many countries around the world. Looking back historically, back into, for example, the rise of radical socialism and communism in the 19th century, and our own experience in that long twilight struggle, are there lessons that we can look at, particularly when we think of what happened in Paris last year, where it does not appear to have been an attack that was driven by command and control from any of the radical groups, but rather was an inspired action? Are there lessons we can take from 150 years or so of the war against communism that might be an example, or are there other examples we might be able to extrapolate a strategy?
Well, that's a good question. If we take the battle against communism, it required obviously a strong military engagement throughout the whole periphery of the Soviet Union. I'm not talking about China now. But it took self-confidence. It took every American president of both parties for a period of more than 50 years supported the policy of containment, which effectively was set in place in 1945. And every president of both parties and a majority of Congress were willing to fund a military that gave credibility to the fact that we intended to stand up to them. But we also had confidence in our own system. There were people that didn't. There were various domestic groups revolting one way or the other, particularly, by the way, in the case of communism, on the university campuses in the late 60s and early 70s. But other than that, I think the American people solidly supported, which is why I keep coming back to the values. We have to believe in the values that we stand for. They're written down. It's not hard to figure out. Probably any sixth grader could give you a pretty good sense of what our values are. So we have to retain self-confidence in that. We promoted the narrative in the case of the communists through organizations like Radio Free Europe. So there are ways to have a counter-narrative put out, but at the bottom, it has to be driven by self-confidence in our own society. And again, the political correctness begins to gnaw a little bit at the edge of that when you start telling people, no, you can't say that because, that might be taken as harmful by somebody. Once you start compromising at the edges like that, you get yourself into I'll give you a good example. Guantanamo. You talked about Guantanamo. There was a story in the press last week that the presiding judge, he's a colonel, decided that we would no longer use female, I guess they're MPs, to escort the prisoners to and from whatever they were going because the prisoners objected to having the females there. Now, I find that just the kind of thing that should not be happening. If the military rotates these people, I don't know how long they stay in Guantanamo 90 days or however long they say, and a woman comes up and it's her turn to go, and she goes, and then we say, no, but you can't escort the prisoner. Aren't we then agreeing with the prisoner's definition of how he should be treated? You know, it's little steps like this that make me uneasy. But if we're confident in our own free society, and we have every reason to be, that counter narrative can be put out through all available means, and should be. Let me go to somebody who hasn't had a question. Mr. Ambassador. You need a mic here.
I couldn't agree more with practically all the things you said. But let me ask you to comment on two aspects. One is on the indispensable nation. The other one also on the treatment of the Muslim populations in the West. The indispensable nation, I quite agree with you. We need the United States to remain the indispensable nation. Obviously, there's been some dithering in the last few years about whether the Americans or the leadership in America wanted to keep that sort of leadership. But at the end of the day, you don't, first of all, you don't become indispensable because you want to be indispensable, but you don't cease to be indispensable because you want to cease to be indispensable. And what we are watching in these last few times is that that's what is happening, that at the end of the day there is some sort of indispensability in the Americans coming to the rescue, you know, which I think is a very positive and it's a very good philosophical and political lesson. I would like you to comment on that sort of inevitability of the indispensability. The second point, and well, I was ambassador here, but later on I was the executive director for counterterrorism at the United Nations. And one of the things we were dealing, well, my side was practically juridical and legal. We were dealing mainly with all the decisions of the Security Council and the General Assembly. But one of the problems we were looking into was how to deal with the minorities in our societies, and in particular with the Muslim minorities in our societies, in America, in Europe, in the West in general. And there is a very different approach, as you know very well. I mean, your approach, which I personally think is the right approach, is that very much what the American president writes to the new citizens. I mean, you are not here, new citizen, because of race or religion or color, whatever. You are here because you decided to adopt a number of principles which are the constitutional principles. And then, well, you have your religion, you have your customs, but you don't import your own customs. You don't go against the customs. Well, in Europe it's quite different, because in Europe, unfortunately, in France, in Belgium, in Paris, in the United Kingdom, you have practically Muslim ghettos of people who are doing exactly what they feel. Isn't there possible to have some sort of conversation among us as to reach some sort of consensus? It's not the solution to the problem, but it's part of the solution to the problem, where people would understand that at the end of the day they have to conform with the rules and regulations and the laws of the country where they live in. Thank you.
Well, on the indispensability question, I hope you're right that under whatever circumstance comes up, when the whistle blows, the United States comes back on the field. The record of the last few years makes me uneasy predicting that. And when I look at both political parties, not just the Democrats, Republicans have got a whole wing that is as isolationist as anybody on the left. Les extrêmes se touchent. So, and I look at the opinion polls. Now, the opinion polls, since ISIS and the beheadings, are starting to move in the right direction, and maybe we'll get back to where there is more political support for the kind of robust engagement that I'm in favor of. But I would not take it as inevitable. If the inevitable always happened in history, there'd be no job for either you as a diplomat or me as a historian, right? You would just sit down like Einstein and you draw out the trend lines and you say, well, that's where we're going to be 50 years from now. It doesn't work that way. Because guess what? There's a bunch of human beings involved, and a bunch of human beings are inevitably unpredictable. Second, on the minorities, we have a huge advantage because, as Henry Kissinger used to say, we're the only country that was founded on an idea. Not on terrain, but on an idea. Europe has fought, I hardly need to tell you, over territory for so long with so many people moving around. It's quite different. When you take office in the United States government, as I did a number of times, when you go into the military, you swear to defend not a person, not a regime, not a government, a piece of paper. I swear to uphold the Constitution of the United States, not the president. It's a very unique thing. And the Constitution contains basically the charter. That's what the president says when he welcomes a new person in. They get sworn in under the Constitution. Now, it's not that we don't have problems. We do, obviously, particularly with some of our minority communities. And I think the Muslim community in America is rightly concerned about the direction things are going. It's certainly not as bad as it is in parts of Europe. And of course, we have to talk. The Europeans have a more difficult problem because, in a way, it requires. When I was in the Netherlands, more than half of the people this is now 30 years ago, more than half the people in prisons were not Dutch. They had other passports. They were traffickers and so forth. And so it began to raise the question, what does it mean to be Dutch? You just have to speak Dutch? Or do you have to, in America, by swearing in on, on the Constitution, you basically commit to a series of political agreements. It's not like that in Europe. And that's why, in some ways, why you have the ghettos, particularly in France and in Britain, that you mentioned. There, as in my answer to the earlier question, the need is for better dialogue between the people in power, whoever they are, parliaments or whatever they are, and the leaders of those communities. And the burden is on the leaders of those communities to bring those communities along and bring them into the broader society. It's absolutely essential and much more difficult to do in Europe than here. Not that we don't have problems. We sure do.
One more question, maybe. Sharon, right there.
Thanks very much. Just under the rules of my craft, I worked for Ambassador Bremer when he was in the counterterrorism office.
I did not sell tickets to this thing.
Right.
Believe me.
But I want to raise an issue that predates you.
Good Lord.
When Secretary Schultz was in office, and when I came to work there, one of the things we wove into a lot of President Reagan's speeches was that terrorists were criminals. They should be prosecuted regardless of the cause. They weren't freedom fighters. And as Mr. Olson mentioned, there's an issue of there seemed to be a romantic aspect among some people being attracted to terrorism. Do you think we're doing enough to try to deglamorize terrorists? I mean, one of the issues that comes up is, I was reminded the London bombings, for example. I mean, what real impact did that do to further the cause of a caliph? Or bin Laden's, one of his goals in 9/11 was to hurt the American economy. Well, it was a very small blimp. But the point is, I think we're failing to get across enough that, A, these guys are criminals. Most of the people involved in Paris so far seem to have criminal backgrounds. And, they really haven't accomplished a great deal except for the headlines and, mainly some personal gratification.
Well, I actually don't, and I didn't, as you know, agree with defining them as criminals in the Reagan years. I thought they're not criminals, they're ideologues. There were some of them are criminals, and they clearly commit criminal acts. Murder is criminalization, is a criminal act. As for their glamorization, I think anybody who witnessed the beheadings on television got a pretty good idea of what kind of people we're dealing with here. So I think it would be a mistake to consider them as criminals only. They are criminals, but that's the wrong approach. They are ideologues. They have declared, these Muslim extremists, as my Counterterrorism Commission, as you know, Mike, because you helped with it, as we reported, they declared war on the West in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. We didn't declare war on them. They declared war on us. And it's an ideological war, and as I mentioned, it's global. It may not be, at this point, an existential threat to the United States. Could get there if they get their hands on really bad stuff. But it certainly can pose an existential threat to other countries, particularly in the Middle East region. So it's something we need to take seriously if we're going to continue to be the world leader. And I think, again, just to finish on the same point, when we say what should we do, we should go back and examine what we stand for. This is really the message of Charlie Hebdo. What do we stand for? And once we have answered that honestly and done away with the cobwebs of political correctness and speech codes and not wanting to say anything that might be hurtful to somebody, we can begin to construct a realistic and robust foreign policy. Thank you very much.
Well done. Great. You're pretty smooth in your old age, eh? I think you're getting politically correct.
Before Ambassador will let you go, on a personal level, I would like to present to you what we call an award of excellence because of your many years of support of our work. So we have a little plaque here, the Inter-University Center for Terrorism Studies Award of Excellence, presented to Ambassador Paul Bremer in recognition of extraordinary contribution to academic counterterrorism program.
Thank you, Yono.
Thank you very much. It's all yours.
Well, let me just add, Mr. Ambassador, just superb. It was, I thought, a great dialogue, a great discussion, and certainly the questions and comments from all of our colleagues here were very good. I think in closing, it would, the thought occurred to me when we talk about terrorism and all that, and I've said this before in other forums, terrorism is a tactic, no more, no less. And I personally don't think you can have wars and combat, whether it's military, economic, or any other of the elements of national power influence, against a tactic. What we really need to do is sit down someday in a quiet place and really discuss what this is all about and what this radical jihadist movement is trying to accomplish. And as has been pointed out, it's been stated many times by these radical leaders what their intent is, not unlike Hitler's intent in Mein Kampf in the 1930s. And so the intent is out there. And we need to mobilize not just our country, but the free world as we know it today to combat this intent, because it's not good for anybody's future. And if you want your children and those that you love and all that to really have an opportunity 50 or 100 years from now, this intent must be defeated. And it can't be defeated only by the military or economic or sanctions, or it needs to be defeated by a total capability and a total support of all of the elements of national capability and power. And it has to be done together. One of the strong points of the defeat of communism, for example, really was NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was formed and which kept, at the time, 16 nations together on what had to be done. And we need that kind, we have these kind of alliances, we've had them, we need more of them. So I would hope that in the future we can have some seminars and some discussions to talk about a true strategy to come to grips with this challenge that we face and to defeat it. And the way you defeat it in the long run is really convince these people that it's not worth it. And I agree with the idea too that it has a major player has to be the Muslim religion, the moderate Muslim religion that we know exists all around the world, including in Indonesia and elsewhere. In fact, they're among the most moderate, in my humble opinion. And so that's my thought for the day. And thanks again for all of you for being with us.
Thank you very much.
All right, my friend.
I'm going to get in your book.
Okay.
Okay? Yes,
And the only thing we need is
I'm getting the interview.
according to Dex on my other chat.
I had to wait.
Yeah, I know.
You wake them up the wrong way.